Hello and welcome to the race data for the Mexican Grand Prix, the series in which I will be compiling mostly the lap times for all of the races this weekend, in an effort to sort of compare each of the teammates together to see exactly how well they did against one another, as well as giving a general overview of what happened in the race. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you would like me to talk about. So let us begin with the overview of the race, and we start with the most boring positions table of the season. Apart from pit stops that we can see from laps 10 to lap 16 for the sort of midfield to the back of the grid, and then from laps 26 to 34 for the front runners, literally no positions changed whatsoever. We do see the Ferrari swap at lap 56 for Charles Leclerc and also Carlos Sainz, and then the Ferrari re-swap at lap 68. But moving from the really boring positions table, we take a look at the lap chart, and we can see the safety car period for the opening 5 laps of this race, where the lap times were just over 2 minutes in the region of 136 seconds. Then we can see the first group of early pit stops, people pitting early off of the mediums and also Esteban Ocon off of the softs. And then we have the main bulk of pit stops in the middle of the race, as well as a couple of the fastest lap pit stops, including 2 for Valtteri Bottas at the very end. But zooming in on the section of racing that we're most interested in, so excluding all of the pit stops, etc., we can see that in the opening stint of the race, there were sort of 3 distinct bands of racing, which is quite nice to see. You could argue that the front runners were in their own different bands, so we had clearly Max Verstappen was about 0.3 a lap faster than Lewis Hamilton, who was himself a couple of tenths faster than Sergio Perez, who himself was a couple of tenths faster than Gasly, who himself was a couple of tenths faster than the midfield, etc. etc. But it just feels sensible to clump those 4 drivers together into one pace group. And usually where we see these pace bands, or these bands of racing as I like to call them, is at the opening stint of the race. That is where the biggest pace differential between all of the teams happens, as usually that builds up a nice buffer for the front running teams that they don't have to run as hard at the end of the race and basically push all the way to the end. And if we head back to the lap chart, we can see that very clearly once again happening here, as there's sort of 3 bands at the middle portion of the race just before their pit stops, as the front runners are all sort of setting the same lap times, they're just even in the gaps, and then at the very end it's very indistinguishable as to who's actually quicker, although it is definitely the 2 Red Bulls, which are the yellow and the grey lines. And then just taking a look at the gap to the race leader chart, we can see that Max Verstappen in the grey line is always at the bottom apart from laps 34 to 40 where he pitted and Sergio Perez came in. And then we can see that Lewis Hamilton was losing time to Sergio Perez right at the very end and falling off of Max Verstappen. But everyone was all fanning out at basically the same rate, which is why it was such a boring race, because the gaps just fanned out and then stayed there. Everyone was losing a couple of tenths to Max Verstappen and the car in front every couple of laps, but that's just a track characteristic of Mexico, unfortunately. Due to the high altitudes, you can't run close to the car in front for a very long period of time, otherwise your car will just boil and it won't run very well. So you have to have these gaps, and then these gaps just get slightly bigger and slightly bigger every single every single lap. But what we can do with all of the lap times in the Mexican Grand Prix is we can isolate each driver's clean air lap. Now for Mexico, this was set at 2.5 seconds to the car in front. So any lap times that were set outside of 2.5 seconds of the car in front were considered a clean air lap. These then go through a small truncation period where the slowest 30% of those 2.5 second laps get removed, as well as the fastest 2, just taking care of any fastest lap pit stops, etc, etc. Then those remaining laps get averaged out, and we end up with a leaderboard that looks a little like this, with the average lap column just here, with the gap to the right of it here. So it was Sergio Perez, the Mexican home hero, who had the fastest pace in clean air by just 0.1 to Max Verstappen, and then 0.2 back to Lewis Hamilton, and interestingly 0.3 back to Valtteri Bottas. So the 2 Red Bulls and the 2 Mercedes were leaps and bounds faster than the rest of the field, as it was then half a second between Bottas and Sainz. This gap is then converted into a percentage, which will allow us to compare each of the races previous this season. There is then the number of clean air laps as well. So Sergio Perez had 20 compared to Max Verstappen's whopping 50, which again converted to a percentage of the total race distance was 28% for Perez and 70% for Max Verstappen. There is then the standard deviation column, which just shows the driver's consistency of the counted clean air laps. A higher standard deviation is less consistent, and a lower standard deviation is more consistent. However, arguably it could be said that you would like to see a decreasing trend as the race progresses. The lap times get quicker and quicker as the fuel burns off, so perhaps standard deviation isn't quite the best metric to use for this column. You mainly want to see a decreasing trend in lap time. But then what we can do is we can take that middle percentage column and average it across all of the races that have happened so far this season, excluding the 2 rainy races of Imola and Turkey, and then obviously excluding the fast race of Belgium, and then subtracting the driver who has the lowest percentage, so the highest driver is set at 0. We end up with a table that looks a little like this. Max Verstappen is still the fastest driver in clean air, only just by 0.07% per lap to Lewis Hamilton, where 0.07% per lap around a circuit like Spa, a long circuit around 100 seconds, is 0.07 of a second. Where around shorter tracks like Mexico and Monaco, that is closer to 0.5 per racing lap. That is literally nothing. And then heading back to the table, we have Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas a little ways behind, and then Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc being the only drivers within a percent. And then doing exactly the same for the teams, we can see that again Mercedes and Red Bull are just 0.05% behind. They've been about this close for the past 4 to 5 races now. There is literally nothing to choose between them, but Red Bull is just the quicker car, with Ferrari the 3rd quickest car and McLaren the 4th. So let's just quickly visualize where each of these drivers' clean air laps popped up during the race, and that looks a little something like this. And we can see for Sergio Perez, who was the fastest in clean air, set every single one of his clean air laps after lap number 33, whereas both Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton both had a significant chunk before lap 33. Now, to offset this whole pace difference between lap times set in the second half of the race being faster than those set in the first half, I have done this whole clean air lap analysis break down to the stints of each driver. So the clean air lap pace of the drivers on stint number 1 looks a little like this, for the medium compound tyre runners on the left and the hard compound of tyre runners on the right. Drivers with a bracketed asterisk by their name, so Stroll, Giovinazzi, Mazepin and Latifi, were drivers who ran the medium tyre in stint number 1 but failed to set any clean air lap times. And we can see that both Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen are literally identical. There is just 7 thousandths between them per lap across 6 and 14 clean air laps respectively, with Lewis Hamilton being just over a tenth behind and then Carlos Sainz being 6 tenths back. Equally, just ignore that standard deviation for Lewis Hamilton at 30.26. That is incorrect. That should be 0.26. Then doing exactly the same breakdown for stint number 2, where most people ran the hard compound of tyres, it is again Sergio Perez who pops up as the fastest driver in stint number 2, the only driver, interestingly, to average out under 1 minute 20. And he was almost 2 tenths quicker than Max Verstappen, who at this point has a massive margin over the rest of the field, so has no need to drive quickly, whereas Sergio Perez is trying to catch up to Lewis Hamilton in his clean air to overtake him for P2. But this is where the gap drops off for Lewis Hamilton, as he was on those older hard compound of tyres by 11 laps, so he is now half a second back from the 2 Red Bulls, with again Carlos Sainz being half a second back from that. And with the race overview all done and dusted for the Mexico City Grand Prix, we'll now break down each of the teammates. Like I said, everything is timestamped in the description down below. We are going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, starting with Mercedes and ending with Williams. I will, however, be explaining all of the graphs in the Mercedes panel, so if you want to stick around for the explanation if you are new to this series, then we'll dive through that right now. So on screen is the Mercedes panel that we will be looking at. In the top left, we have their lap time chart. Lewis Hamilton is in the black line and Valtteri Bottas is in the Mercedes turquoise. The grey dotted line is the highest finishing Mercedes car in the previous Mexican Grand Prix in 2019. With the graph directly below that being the Mercedes gaps chart, which just demonstrates the gap between each of the 2 cars on every single lap of the race. We then have the Mercedes positions chart in the top right, and then finally we have the percentage pace difference from Hamilton to Bottas in the bottom right. So this percentage pace difference between Hamilton and Bottas takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, will divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, converts them all to a percentage, where then any percentage above 100 is where Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and any percentage below 100 is where Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These percentages are then ordered from largest down to smallest, and then we end up with a distribution that looks a little something like this, which we can split down the middle, and we can see that for just 15.5% of the laps raced together, it was Valtteri Bottas who was the faster Mercedes, and therefore for 85.5% it was Lewis Hamilton. This is one of the largest Mercedes differences we've seen all season. And taking a look at stint number 1, we can see a ridiculous pace gulf of well over a second per lap between the two cars, mainly due to Valtteri Bottas having to fight his way through the field, although he got stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo for a large portion of it, whereas Lewis Hamilton is quite comfortable running in P2. This extends the gap all the way up to a minute before the first pit stop, which drops the gap down to 40 seconds. Then after Valtteri Bottas' second pit stop, they actually set fairly similar lap times, with the gap staying at around 100 seconds for around 10 or 15 laps, as Hamilton is setting extremely consistent lap times. From lap 40 all the way to the end, he was always between a 1 minute 21 and a 1 minute 20. So showing his supreme consistency over Valtteri Bottas, who actually slowed down through this same period of time up until his two fastest lap pit stops to steal it from Max Verstappen. But just comparing Mercedes' 2019 pace to their 2020 pace, they set a 120.4 in 2019 compared to Hamilton setting a 120.5 in 2021, so there was just a 10th difference between the 2 years, which actually is only a really small difference for Mercedes that we've seen this year. The trend that has been observed so far by Mercedes and equally Aston Martin is they have lost a significant chunk of time from their previous running at these circuits. Whereas the teams like Red Bull and Ferrari haven't lost anywhere near as much time as Mercedes and Aston Martin. Which is where the whole pace difference of this year comes from. Every single team has been ripped down a couple of rungs. It's just Mercedes and Aston Martin, the low rake versions of these Formula 1 cars, have been ripped down many more rungs than Red Bull and the higher rake cars. It's just Mercedes' pace advantage in 2020 was so great that being ripped down a second per lap has only just brought them level to Red Bull, whereas Aston Martin in the midfield, remember they were Racing Point and they were top of the midfield in 2020, being ripped down a second per lap has now put them at the bottom of the midfield, which is why they were extremely unhappy at the start of the year. And comparing the two drivers' stint number 1 pace, where Bottas was on the hards and Hamilton was on the medium, there was just a 700th of a second difference. With stint number 2, there was a 2/10 difference in Hamilton's favour when the tyres were reversed. And so from Mercedes, we'll now take a look at Red Bull. And starting with their percentage pace difference, we can split this down the middle, and we can see that for 35.2% of the race, it was Sergio Perez in the darker blue line who was the faster Red Bull, and for 64.8%, it was Max Verstappen in the light blue. And this is one of their closer trends that we've observed so far this season. It usually lies in excess of 70-30 in favour of Max Verstappen. And we can see that in the opening stint, there was pretty much nothing to separate the two drivers. There was probably a 2 to 3/10 gap between them every single lap in Max Verstappen's favour, enough to extend the race gap to 10 seconds by lap 20. And we can see the point where Sergio Perez managed to overtake Max Verstappen when he came in for the pit stops just here, and then straight after Sergio Perez's pit stops, they were setting equal lap times. But like I said in the clean air lap segment of this video, there is no need for Max Verstappen to be going so quickly, whereas Sergio Perez does have a need to be going so quick. And then interestingly, on lap 68, we see an extremely slow lap, an uncharacteristically slow lap from Max Verstappen, a 1 minute 23, where he's been comfortably setting 1 minute 20s. And this was in order to mess with Valtteri Bottas to slow him down so he couldn't steal the fastest lap from him. Then taking a look at Red Bull's pace compared to 2019, we can see that they were actually quicker in 2021 by half a second than their 2019 pace. And this is where that deficit really comes in. So Mercedes ended up losing time to 2019, whereas Red Bull ended up gaining time on 2019, but this whole gaining time on the previous evolution of car hasn't really happened that often. The last time we really saw it was at Spain, where the track physically changed, so only on very rare occasions has the track been identical and the 2021 cars have gone a little bit quicker. But Sergio Perez was the faster driver by just over a tenth across the entire Grand Prix, and stint number 1, they were literally dead even, just 7 thousandths between them, and stint number 2, it was just under 2/10 of a second in the Mexicans' favour. And from Red Bull, we will now take a look at McLaren, and again, splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 18.6% it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue who was the faster of the papaya cars, and therefore for 81.4% it was Lando Norris. And this is one of the more extreme McLaren trends that we've seen so far. They've usually been closer to 60-40 in Lando Norris's favour, but there have been a few races that have been 80-20 in Ricciardo's favour. But taking a look at stint number 1, the two McLarens were running extremely slow before they actually managed to speed up, in the 1-minute 24s, before they came down into the 1-minute 22s. But we can see it was Lando Norris who was able to put in some mid 1-minute 22s, whilst Daniel Ricciardo is still around the 1-minute 23s, so there was a comfortable 1 second gulf between the two drivers, even though there wasn't that much of a positional difference at this stage. They then both come into their pit stops relatively close to each other, and interestingly, no driver gains or loses time, as before the pit stop for Daniel Ricciardo, the gap was 20 seconds, and then after Lando Norris's pit stop, the gap was still 20 seconds, so neither driver gained or lost out. However, once again, post-pit stop, Lando Norris was easily able to switch on the tyres compared to Daniel Ricciardo, and again opened up a 2-second gulf between the two cars. And then taking a look at McLaren's 2019 pace compared to 2020, they were 3/10, almost 4/10 quicker in 2019. Where there was interestingly a 7.5 gulf between the two drivers across the whole race. With stint number 1, it was 6.5 for the medium tyre for Lando Norris and the hards for Ricciardo, and stint number 2, it was just over 6.5, again in favour of Lando Norris. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 27.5% it was Lance Stroll in the pink who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 72.5% it was Sebastian Vettel in the green. This genuinely was a really strong race for Sebastian Vettel, and not so much for Lance Stroll. He actually really struggled in this Grand Prix, whereas Vettel was able to come away with some decent points. However, it hasn't always been the case. Sometimes we have seen some 75-25 splits in favour of Stroll. And again, similar to the McLarens, we can see a large pace gulf between the two drivers open up in the first portion of this race, up until an extremely early pit stop for Lance Stroll at lap 12. They then both come in for some pit stops again around lap 33, where the gap is hovering around 50 seconds. Then after this pit stop, they are setting literally identical lap times, mid 1-minute 21s. We then unfortunately see an extremely slow lap from Lance Stroll, whether this was a mistake, him cutting across the grass, I'm not 100% sure what this was, as Sebastian Vettel is still setting mid 1-minute 21s, which extends the gap to above 70 seconds. We then again see 2 slow laps from both drivers, which peak at pretty much the same lap time at almost a 1-minute 24, which is them getting out of the way of the faster cars behind. So taking a look at Aston Martin's 2019 pace, we can see that they were faster in 2019 by just 0.2, which is actually one of the least significant impacts that they've had so far this season, much like Mercedes. And there was just under a tenth of a difference between the two drivers in Vettel's favour. With stint number 1, Stroll failing to set any clean air laps on his medium tyres, and stint number 2, he failed to set any again on his hards. Then from Aston Martin, we'll take a look at Alpine, and we can split the percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 11.4% of the race, it was Esteban Ocon in the white who was the faster car, and therefore for 88.6%, it was Fernando Alonso in the blue. This was actually a fairly strong race for Alpine. Yes, only one car scored points, but they were fairly equal. Even though the pace percentage says otherwise, taking a look at the laps chart, there really wasn't too much to discern the two cars. However, it was an extremely early pit stop for Esteban Ocon as he started on the soft compound of tyre. Where after his pit stop, there was again probably a 4/10 gap between the two drivers, so a fairly significant pace difference, but really not too bad. Then after Alonso's mid-race pit stop, Esteban Ocon does slowly pick up the pace just a little bit, and the pace deficit is nowhere near as significant as it was in the first half of the race. And once again, like the two Aston Martins, we see some two late race lap time peaks, which are just them getting out of the way of the faster cars. So taking a look at Alpine's pace to 2019, they were actually just a little bit quicker by 11/100ths of a second in 2021 than they were in 2019, with there again being a just under 4/10 difference between Ocon and Alonso. With stint number 1, Ocon not setting any clean air laps on his soft compound of tyre, and then in stint number 2, it was just over 6/10 in Alonso's favour. So from Alpine, we'll now take a look at Ferrari, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that it was for 52.9%, it was Carlos Sainz who was the faster car in the black, and therefore for 47.1%, it was Charles Leclerc. So Ferrari really did have an exceptional race this weekend, and we can see that in the opening stints, they were literally setting identical times. The gap was staying at under 4 seconds for almost 30 laps, right up until Charles Leclerc's pit stop around lap 30. And we can see that post Carlos Sainz pit stop, he was able to close down an 8-second gap to Charles Leclerc to 2 seconds in just 10 laps. This instigated the first Ferrari switch, where Charles Leclerc had his slow 1 minute 24 lap and they swapped positions, where Carlos Sainz was then able to build up an 8-second gap again in his favour across 10 laps. However, it wasn't quite enough to catch the car in front, which I believe was Pierre Gasly, so he had to lose that 8-second gap he built over Charles Leclerc and switch positions again. And then taking a look at Ferrari's 2019 pace, we can see that it was 8/10 faster in 2019. They had such a strong 2019 Mexican Grand Prix, and even though they were so good in the midfield in 2021, they were nowhere near as quick as they were in 2019. With Sainz being significantly quicker by just 3.5 tenths per lap in clean air over Charles Leclerc, and in stint number 1, again it was 3.5 tenths, and stint number 2 it was over half a second. Then from Ferrari we'll take a look at AlphaTauri, which unfortunately there really isn't too much to look at, as it was Yuki Tsunoda who ended up retiring on lap number 1. So we can instead just take a look at AlphaTauri's pace to 2019, where Pierre Gasly was actually 9/10 slower than their 2019 pace. We can then do the stint breakdown, however there is nothing to compare Gasly to, as Tsunoda didn't set any clean air laps, nor did he set any clean air laps in stint number 2. So from AlphaTauri, we'll now take a look at Alfa Romeo. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 15.7% of the race, it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 84.3%, it was Kimi Räikkönen. And interestingly, the two Alfa Romeos in the opening stint before Giovinazzi's extremely early pit stop, they were dead even. The gap was staying at 5 seconds. There was a relatively large positional difference between them. Giovinazzi was running in P6, P7, and Kimi Räikkönen was running in P10/P9. However, Giovinazzi came in for a ridiculously early pit stop, and then he just had to hold on to those hard compound of tyres for over 60 laps. Which unfortunately he was just not able to do, where after Kimi Räikkönen's pit stop, Räikkönen easily held a half a second advantage per lap over Giovinazzi. So Giovinazzi was really quite buggered by his team in strategy, whereas if he'd have pitted at the same time as Kimi Räikkönen or a couple of laps before or after, he'd have ended up beating Räikkönen quite convincingly. So taking a look at Alfa Romeo's pace compared to 2019, they were again a 10th quicker in 2021 than they were in 2019. So far only the second team along with Red Bull to go quicker in 2021, but nowhere near as significantly as Red Bull did. With unfortunately there being a large half a second deficit between the two drivers in Räikkönen's favour, where stint number 1, Giovinazzi failed to set any clean air laps, and then stint number 2, it was just under 7 tenths between the two drivers. Then penultimately we'll take a look at Haas, where again there isn't too much to look at, as unfortunately Mick Schumacher ended up retiring on lap number 1. But however, what this lap time chart does highlight is the supreme inconsistency of Nikita Mazepin. There were no 2 laps where he'd set consistent times. It is so zigzaggy, so wiggly-waggly, it is unbelievable. But taking a look at the Haas's pace to 2019, they were 1.5 seconds slower in 2021 than they were in 2019. That is absolutely significant. However, if Mick Schumacher had raced, this would have been closer. This is the trend that we've seen so far this season, where Mazepin has often been the slower car in clean air, so this isn't too fair of a comparison to make, as it is the wrong driver to be looking at. And again, like Alfa Tauri, we can take a look at stint number 1, no clean air laps, and stint number 2, it was a 1:24.3, but we have nothing to compare it to. So finally, we will take a look at Williams, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 44.9% it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue, who was the faster of the two Williams, and therefore for 55.1% it was George Russell in the white. Now this is a fairly standard Williams split. Sometimes it is 55% in favour of Latifi, and sometimes it's 55% in favour of George Russell. Russell really does have a habit of outperforming himself in qualifying and then just not having the car underneath him to continue that good qualifying performance in the race, which we can see quite clearly in his positions chart where he just fell backwards and backwards and backwards. Both Williams, however, came in for extremely early pit stops around lap 12 to 15, with George Russell coming in just that little bit after Nicholas Latifi, and then in the middle portion of the race, both drivers were actually fairly inconsistent. There really wasn't too much to pick between them. The gap was sort of fluctuating quite a lot, between 20 and 30 seconds, for around 20 or so laps. However, it is after Latifi's second pit stop where he actually set some supremely consistent lap times, consistently just under 1 minute 22, which George Russell, which we can see in the white, is unable to do, mainly because he tried to do a one-stop race. So his lap times were so inconsistent, allowing the gap to be closed from 50 seconds at lap 52 all the way down to 15 seconds at the checkered flag in just 20 or so laps. Then taking a look at Williams' pace in 2019, they were interestingly 0.2 quicker in 2021, with Nicholas Latifi being the slightly faster car. So this Mexican Grand Prix weekend, we've actually seen quite a lot of the teams go faster in 2021 over 2019. Where stint number 1, neither driver set any clean air laps, and then in stint number 2, where they were both on the hards, the gap was 4.5 tenths. And there we go, there is all of the race data concluded for the Mexico City Grand Prix. Please let me know of anything in the comments down below that you found interesting about this video, and what was your favourite moment about the slightly boring Mexican Grand Prix. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.